All right, why don't we get started? We have an hour and a half, and I know we have quite a lot to discuss on this panel, so let's get started. Welcome everyone. We are expecting about 400 people, 450 to join us today from all sectors and roles and industry. Obviously, the role of the governance professional and directors in this crisis are amplified, and boards are seeking support and guidance while they navigate this unprecedented time and challenges that it presents. So the new normal in governance, this panel, managing shifting board priorities in COVID times and beyond, is a crucial conversation to be having on an ongoing basis. And so this is why GPC is bringing you a panel of experts and practitioners who can help you navigate these rough waters. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our panel, and then Poonam, you can provide some more, provides a little bit more context around the discussion. So Poonam Puri is our moderator today. She is a professor at Osgoode Hall Law School and an affiliate scholar, also at Davies Ward Phillips and Weinberg. David Beatty is chair of the David and Sharon Johnston Center for Corporate Governance Innovation and is professor of strategy at Rotman. Brigitte Catelier is a vice president of corporate governance for Meridian Credit Union. Dominique Marino is partner of national leader for forensic services at PwC. And Margie Perrick is a principal on governance consulting and a board director. So over to you, Poonam, and I will blank my screen.
All right, thanks very much, Lynn, for that overview and introduction. I'm really pleased to be able to moderate the session today. COVID-19 has had such an impact on Canadian organizations like no other event that I can think of. Even the financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9 compares pale. And the implications of COVID-19 as we look forward will be transformational at many levels: financial, people and talent management, customer needs and preferences, and business models and strategy. And business will not return back to the old normal. Boards and senior management teams will have to make difficult judgment calls that will dictate what the new normal will look like. And further to this point, boards and senior management of all types of organizations, large and small, public companies, private companies, for-profit, not-for-profit, cooperatives, crown corporations, are actively working through these issues. And it's with this background and with this context that we put this panel together. We have an outstanding group of panelists with a diverse range of backgrounds, as Lynn has briefly highlighted. Their detailed bios are available to you on the GPC website, so I'm not going to go through them in any detail. We have an impressive group of attendees as well, so thank you for attending. I'm hoping that each of you will feel comfortable asking any questions that you might have through the chat feature on the Zoom platform. We'll try and address as many questions as we can during the webinar. And for those that we can't get to, we're hoping that we'll be able to address them in an individualized way afterwards. Now, I've prepared questions in 4 areas: financial, people, employees, customers, and business opportunities, strategies, business models as we look forward. And so also, given the nature of the membership of GPC, an overarching theme for today's session, of course, is what is the appropriate role of the board vis-a-vis management, and how can governance professionals be best assisting boards living up to their obligations and duties. So let's turn first to some of the financial implications and issues. And of course, the financial impact of this pandemic has been huge. COVID-19 has paralyzed the economy by shutting down businesses, brick and mortar retailers, restaurants, construction sites, mines, entertainment venues, and the list goes on. And of course, this is having secondary effects on other businesses. And we've got a staggering number of people who used to be employed and are now sitting at home. Analysts and companies are cutting, all sorts of forecasts. And I guess in this context, my first question to the panel, and Bridget, perhaps you could start off, is, what sort of financial information do you think is necessary for management to be sharing with their boards at this time? And what sort of scenario planning and forecasting are boards expecting, and what can management reasonably provide at this time? So I know that's a loaded question, but hopefully you've got all the parts there.
Thank you, Poonam. So good afternoon. I'm pleased to be on this panel, and I just wanted, because I'm the first speaker, to take the opportunity to thank Poonam for developing the interesting topic we're dealing with today, and also GPC, Lynn and her team. So dealing first with this question, I think we need a little bit of background in terms of timing. So mid-March, the World Health Organization characterized COVID-19 as a pandemic. And this timing is important because many companies have a December 31st year end. And this means that the critical path for them began at the end of their first quarter. And so we're thinking 2 months into the year, the annual plan or your budget for the year is off the table. And this is due to the prolonged crisis. We're not dealing with a temporary crisis. We're dealing with a prolonged crisis that's going to have prolonged effects. So no one can predict the scale or length of the disruption of from COVID-19 or how deep and severe the economic and health impacts will be. But we do know the pandemic has caused unprecedented economic destruction. We know the economy will rebound, but we don't know when, and more importantly, we don't know how fast. And that's the whole point of the VU and W curves we've been talking about. So with this maximal uncertainty and the market volatility, it's impossible for management to build a forecast. And worse yet, the full impact of COVID-19 will materialize in the second quarter results. So as we see the second quarter earnings coming out, we're going to see further downward pressure on the stock market and further volatility. Now, boards are asking management for numbers. And why are they doing that? They're doing that because they need information to make decisions. And that requires scenario planning. But management is challenged because, selecting what reasonable scenario they're seeing is very difficult. So management is developing forward-looking scenarios with an S. So we're seeing many scenarios, and they're based on a range of assumptions and stress testing. Now, the assumptions can relate to macroeconomic, market-specific, industry-specific drivers that can impact the company's business and performance for the remainder of the year. The assumptions also involve a potential timeline for economic recovery or accessing a government relief, or even staggered return to work in Q3, Q4, or even 2021. But the important thing is that scenario planning is the basis for board and management discussions going forward. It also drives internal and external communications. And government and regulations have quickly implemented some relief measures. We even heard of some today. And there's uncertainty around the scope and effect of these measures and how long they'll last and how to plan for when they'll be lifted. And this is another aspect of scenario planning that presents multiple challenges. Finally, there's expense reduction that's a key focus, as well as the CapEx budget. And this is not just going to impact organic growth and investments, but also employee retention. And again, depending how long the crisis will last, this may have a longer term impact going into 2021. So as companies generally plan in the fall, their plan for 2021, we may still be faced with these challenges.
Thanks, Bridget. Margie, do you want to add to that in terms of what you think boards need right now? Margie, we just need you to turn mute off so we can hear you. Thank you.
There we go. Thanks. Yeah. So the two things I would add are, I think we need, we feel uneasy, but we don't want to add to the burden of management. So one thing that's been particularly effective with a couple of my boards is we have a weekly meeting, and it is without documents. It's just a touch point. It's a chance to ask questions. And it's a way of building trust and comfort. Again, we don't want to add to the work of management, but it does allow us to understand what's going on. In terms of the scenario planning, I think we might have learned something, in case the point wasn't clear, from our health officers. Doctors Teresa Tam and my provincial one, Bonnie Henry, said over and over and over that their modeling is not a prediction, it's a planning tool. And I like to think of that with my boards. And in fact, my CEO said and one of my organizations said, "Don't hold me to it." And I think that was that message is really clear. They are planning tools to allow us to prepare for those different scenarios, but not say that is what the outcome will be, because we don't know. So that was a good lesson, I think. And it means we need to have flexibility, but also some trust, two-way trust.
Yeah, you raised some really important points around the difficulties and challenges of scenario planning and the importance of trust between management and the board. Aside from the information that the board needs, obviously there's other considerations for public companies as well, including what sort of continuous disclosure obligations might be triggered in this context, which we won't have time to talk about. But another issue that I'd like to turn to is the issue of dividends, and continuing on the theme of financials. Many companies, of course, pride themselves on passing along a portion of their earnings to shareholders, and that willingness, that ability to pay out dividends over time suggests strength and stability and inspires investor confidence. In this context, there's a number of companies that are announcing that they're canceling or reducing dividends. Others have said that they have no intention on cutting back on dividends. Margie, again, wondering what your view is on dividend programs being temporarily discontinued, and tying in with that, your view on capital expenditures being cut back, which we're also seeing and hearing a lot about.
Yeah, so there's, what are our needs, what are organizations' needs? And there's no doubt that for many organizations, there are liquidity questions and cash management questions. It's a really good question. I'd actually like to focus in on dividends for a bit. That's a natural lever to pull. And I think sometimes we underestimate how significant dividends are. I think worldwide with listed companies, that's around or almost $3 trillion annually. And this is something that supplements people's income. It allows startups to get injections of cash. It's a really important component of a financial building component. And you mentioned reputation, Poonam. If you take our big 5 banks, I think 90% of investors are Canadians, and half of those are normal people. And many of us buy those shares because we know they will have a steady source of income. So it is a matter of reputation. So along with cash and reputation, how do we decide what we do? Well, I think it kind of depends, obviously, but if you're in a situation where the company's receiving a cash stimulus payment from the government, that's probably an indication that you shouldn't be giving away cash. Take Disney, for example. I think they're due to release their dividend in July, and it's just under 2%. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's $1.5 billion at the same time as they are furloughing 100,000 people. Should they be giving away that kind of cash? I would say that has a reputational impact there. So, and in fact, in the EU, in the UK, and some other places, you're not allowed to give a dividend if you're receiving government or taxpayer funds. So I think if the business is in that category, you maybe should not give a dividend. If you're stretched and need the cash, I think your shareholders will understand that this is not business as usual, which is what a dividend kind of signifies, business as usual in good times. So that, I think you won't suffer a reputational backlash if you say we are temporarily halting our dividend program, and I think you will get a lot of understanding there. And if you're in the fortunate category of being a business that is doing well right now, whose balance sheet looks good, and maybe you're actually at capacity or even over capacity, don't hoard the cash. Give it out. People need their dividends, and that money can flow to other organizations as well. So it depends on the situation, but it's an important part that we need to be thinking carefully about.
Thanks, Margie. David, what's your view on dividends and what's happening in the marketplace, and also CapEx?
Well, it does depend on the industry you're in. I think you're in a very different state if you happen to be on the board of Marriott Hotels or Carnival Cruise Lines. And the other parameter would be to what extent has your balance sheet got some resilience? If you spent a lot of money doing share buybacks, as Marriott has done at $150, you've gone to the bank, the C-suite spending its entire time on its knees trying to get an extended line of credit. So if the other hand, if you are in an industry like medical healthcare devices, you probably are trying to cope with the explosive growth of your production capacity. So very different contextual frameworks depending on the industry you're in. That said, I would like to see all companies abandon share buybacks, possibly forever. Certainly never buy them on debt. I think in terms of CapEx, it's going to depend entirely on what your going forward strategy is going to look like. There may be a fundamental pivot in the way in which your business is conformed for the future. And I'd put a hold on them until we had an understanding as a company and a board as to what our future potential scenarios might look like, and then which one are we going to commit to. Dividends, as Margie points out, are really, really hard. A lot of people do depend on dividends for their livelihood, retired people in Canada. And on the other hand, cash is king. Those trade-offs are very, very difficult, as Margie suggested. So work them hard would be my advice to the boards. CapEx, wait till you know what your future is going to look like. Share buybacks, forget them.
All right, thank you. And we'll talk a little bit more about strategy. We've got some questions coming in on strategy that I will ask all of you in a few minutes. Now, more generally, I guess, David and Dominic, what is your view on how boards and management teams are working right now and how they should be? And this ties in with a question we just received, which is how should boards of directors balance between reducing the management burden and implementing the right governance during the pandemic? So David, back to you, and then to Dominic, please.
Okay, I always depend on the chair being the person who makes those determinations. And so I would, as a normal director, defer to the chair, talk to the chair a lot, and keep out of management's way. The burden of management additional duties is not inconsequential when a board starts to thrash around. I've always said I think it's the job of the board chair to be best friends with the CEO. And I don't mean in terms of drinking partner. I mean, I'm prepared as your chair to drop everything and go to your side and work through a problem where you need me. And if I have a governance problem or challenge of one sort or another, I'd expect you to do exactly the same. So it becomes a function of the chair's ability to set the tone and to set the time that's available for meetings. And I think frequent telephone meetings, as Margie suggested, is happening in a lot of her relationships, is exactly the way to go. Frequent communication, terse, to the point, no preparation required. Everybody speak their voice. 20 minutes, half an hour, gone. I'm chairman of 2 companies now, but they happen to be in the private equity world. One of them sinking like a rock, and the other one's taking off like an Apollo rocket. So we got 2 entirely different frameworks, but in both cases, there's almost continuous email between me and the CEOs, and then I'm back to the directors to keep them off the backs of the management team. And we try to have a weekly catch-up meeting. No agenda, is just get the CEO on the line with his key people. What's happened? What's going on? What are you worried about? What should we be worried about? Continuous, open, transparent, and honest communication is the key at this moment in time.
Thanks,
Dominic?
David. Dom, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, look, I agree with everything David said. And I guess what I'd say is, from our experience, I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find any organization that's just kind of sitting on its hands right now. Everybody's doing something. The question that we're really kind of challenging our clients on is, are you doing the right things? So, to David's point, everybody's having the 2 call a day crisis management discussion. And frankly, I think we're seeing a lot of fatigue in that. And so, clients are asking us, when can we stand down this team and go back to BAU? And kind of our response to that is, the key in order to, start to return to some sort of business as usual is to have structure around your crisis response. That is critical. And so the way we look at it, both internally at PwC and how we're actually advising our clients, is 3 stages. We've got the mobilized stage, which is, organizations really just working on, the key fires in front of them, i.e., health and safety, making sure that their network and bandwidth can support the working from home community now. Then we move into stabilize, which what we're finding is most organizations are there now, where they're dealing with things like, cash management, scenario planning, supply chain issues, etc. But most important is getting into the strategize phase. And, not everyone will get there, unfortunately. Many organizations might be stuck in stabilize and may not be thinking about kind of what the new normal will look like and how they're going to transform their business to enter into strategize. And that is critical. A few years back, there was a group of UK researchers. I believe it's Knight and Preddy, I believe, and they completed a really interesting study where they looked at the correlation between the share values of public companies and how the market perceived their response to crises. And what they found was there was a 22% share difference between those that were perceived to respond well versus those that were perceived to being stuck in the stabilized mode and were not really transforming.
Poonam, maybe I'd like to add something, if I may, on this question. So just to tie into what David was mentioning, so when we came out of crisis management training last year, one of the things we implemented as a best practice was to use the chair as a channel of communication to the board, and that ties into what David was mentioning, but a bit of a different approach in terms of just these touch points or informal. So we've been developing what we are calling our COVID-19 reporting to the board throughout this crisis, and it began at first. It was too intense, and there was a long report prepared on a weekly basis. But it's evolved, and the interesting thing about the efforts placed on this COVID-19 report is how it's going to now be incorporated in the agenda for our quarterly meetings in May. So there's been a lot of great communication between the board and management, and we've seen huge value to this formal reporting that has been developed. It's helped management and it's helped the board as well. And as I mentioned, the challenge now is to see what our agendas are going to look like to stimulate these conversations around COVID-19, in forward-looking, but also in terms of business as usual.
That's a really good point. So lots of responsibility on the board chair to coordinate and collaborate with the CEO, and clearly the nature of the reporting, both the timing, the frequency, and the content will change as the days and weeks progress. I'd like to now turn to issues relating to the workforce and spend a few minutes on questions relating to human capital. And as I've stated on other occasions at GPC and elsewhere, obviously people are critical to the success of any organization. And if you can harness your people to bring their best to the table in terms of operations and experimentation and creation, that's what's critical, of course, for sustainable value creation. And in ordinary times, that means recruiting and retaining and promoting and recognizing the best talent from the board to the CEO to the senior management team throughout the organization. In this context, obviously, we're dealing with a lot of changes in terms of the workforce, mass layoffs, health and safety concerns for those businesses that do continue, for employees that are able to work from home, facing all sorts of childcare and elder care issues. Dominic, again, perhaps I could ask you to speak a little bit more about how businesses should be thinking about their employees at this time. How should short-term workforce needs be balanced against the importance of retaining critical talent and preserving talent generally?
Yeah, so I think, as it relates to workforce planning, Poonam, it really goes hand in hand with your scenarios, right? So you can't be thinking about your workforce in a silo, in isolation, without thinking about what the future strategy of your organization will be. That said, many of the discussions we're having with clients around workforce planning is really around kind of layoffs being the lever of last resort. And to start by looking at other opportunities within payroll to preserve cash, which could include reducing non-salary compensation. Other opportunities include deferring existing obligations for a period, i.e. matching RSP contributions, performance pay, or other fringe benefits. We're also seeing organizations encouraging staff to take vacation, reduced hours, or voluntary unpaid leave into the fall. Whatever the cost or job saving measures are put in place, organizations need to be mindful that there's a strong possibility that our quarantine and social distancing routines may be in place for many months, potentially 12 to 24 months. And it goes without saying that organizations should also be looking at the 75% wage subsidies, but also thinking about, what kind of models do you have in place to determine if, your revenues can absorb even 25% of your employee workforce. And so the other thing that I would say is, it's critical to consider, succession planning when you're doing your workforce analysis, but I think we're going to touch upon that a little bit later.
Thanks, Tom. Margie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess the main thing I would say is don't underestimate the long-term impact on mental health as well. And I think we will be looking to the advice of experts and psychologists and psychiatrists in that area as well. I think you alluded to the things that are going on at home that we haven't, that we don't have a view into when we're in the workforce. People who've had losses, people who are caring for, who've been with their partners and their kids for months, and how that might impact them when they come back to work. But I think, David used the words a couple of times, honest and transparent, and I think that goes a long way. So I think we need to be clear that we don't know everything, that we are in this together. It sounds so cliche now, but I think it's true. And our employees will give us credit for that kind of honest communication, for figuring things out together. And we need to be flexible. We don't know, and people will be used to different ways of working. And some of those might be good for us. They might be good for the organization. So as we're planning how we manage potential layoffs, and if, again, I agree, that's the last lever, because I think when our employees and our workforce are happy and they feel safe and secure, that reflects on all of the work that we do, and reflects on our clients, and will reflect on our business. So I think it's an easy thing to pass over because we don't understand it well, and we can't grab onto it like we can grab onto programs and numbers, but understanding the mental health issues, and then being flexible and honest and transparent and vulnerable, I think will hold us, is good advice.
All really good points, Margie. Thank you. Let's now turn to compensation. It's always a hot button, even in ordinary times. Some people will complain about the absolute numbers being supersized, and others will complain about the process and the metrics that are used to arrive at the absolute numbers. And recently we're seeing, all sorts of announcements about donations of Q2 salaries, or not taking any base salary for the rest of the year. Wondering, David, first, what you think boards and HR committees should be doing. How should they be assessing CEO compensation, senior management team's compensation for 2020?
Well, I make a distinction between responding to the crisis in terms of what you do with today's compensation program and what you might do to reformulate it for tomorrow. I'm quite encouraged by the fact, I have the numbers from last week from the United States, 235 different companies across 40 different industries have slashed management CEO salaries, and 120 companies that are publicly traded in the United States have taken off directors' fees for the remainder of the year. That's really, to me, an important leadership position. Society as a whole is going through this trauma, and in a way, I hope it engenders more trust in the private sector and publicly traded companies when executives do that. Here in Canada, yesterday's board meeting at First Service, Jay Hennick, the founder and CEO, executive chair, and Scott Patterson, the CEO, both took their salaries to zero. The entire board decided to take no salary for the benefit for the rest of the year, no director's fees, and they cascaded down. I think, to me, this is a real opportunity to show leadership at the top in terms of the fact that we are, as we say again and again, we're all in this together. Well, if you're sitting up there with an $8 million a year salary, I don't think we are all in this together. And even if you go down to 6, that's not going to make a difference to your long-term asset deployment, but it could be a really important demonstration effect. And Izzy Sharp showed us in the 9/11 decline that keeping his employees as their top agenda item was going to give them a long-term competitive advantage that's sustainable, and that proved to be true. It's now being copied by Marriott Asia Pacific, which is doing the same thing. They put all of their employees, they have 1,000 hotels, 300,000 people, and instead of slashing them all, they put everybody on a 4-day week, some on a 3-day week, some who wanted to go away were given leave with right to come back, and on and on and on, so that when we come out of this mess, the most important asset of a hospitality company are its people. And Izzy's built the differentiation of Four Seasons around that concept, lived it through 9/11. He's living it through it again. So I think it's more, Margie, than just mental health is a real issue. I hadn't thought about that one. I know that birth rates will go up in some families and some companies, and divorce rates will go up in other families and other companies. But how we all get out of this, I don't know. But I am thrilled to see more and more companies adopting this idea that in this crisis, we should be having a pare back of our directors' fees and certainly of our senior management. Going forward, I think the compensation committees have to throw out all the old parameters of judging performance and create brand new ones. What is the survival success of our company? Is it keeping our employees happy? Is it being fair and transparent and open with them? Is it finding a pivot point? It's going to have probably nothing in industry after industry to do with where you started the year in terms of how you're going to compensate people in the definition of success. So I think comp committees have got to go back to level 0 and start fresh and say to themselves in the near term for the next 12, say 24 months, how do we establish parameters of success, parameters of successful leadership in order to provide a compensation framework? And it's quite plausible that you would say, we're going to take you back to base salary. There's no performance bonus. There's no stock options. There's nothing. You're going back to the base. And for 12 to 18 months, we're going to live like people who have no jobs, no place to live, and we're all going to hunker down. So whatever happens, comp committees will be very, very busy, I think, going forward.
Agreed. Bridget, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, that's why I unmuted. So I just want to, with respect to the go forward incentive plans, I just want to comment again on timing. So I know many companies are saying it's too early, it's premature at this point to have conversations around incentive plans, particularly for this year. But I think they should actually start immediately having those conversations in terms of reconsidering the drivers behind incentive plans this year, and going to what David was explaining. And you know, these are extraordinary circumstances, and it's going to require a lot of creativity and unique solutions. And you know, and boards can immediately tap into advisors who have a broader information around what other organizations are doing and what creativity they're coming up with. And you know, there's a lot of noise within organizations, and this ties into communications, and it's clear that you know, the efforts that management is putting into managing this crisis are not going to be compensated under the current incentive plans. And you know, some of the drivers the board can consider, I mean, David mentioned some, but there's also you know, the steps that management has taken with respect to this crisis and the tactics you know, they've developed, and to what extent that has reduced the potential impact the crisis may have had. So, but these conversations should take place immediately.
So good points. I think we're all in agreement that HR committees and boards have their work cut out ahead of them in terms of thinking about compensation as we look forward. Let's turn to succession planning. Dom, you hit on it briefly, and obviously one of the critical roles of the board is to hire, fire, and evaluate the CEO, and to make sure that there is a succession plan in place. And one way that the conversation is often framed in boardrooms is, what happens if the CEO gets hit by a bus tomorrow? Who'll take over? And In the current environment, the question, of course, to ask is what happens if the CEO gets COVID? And so, Bridget, wondering if you can speak to what sort of conversations are happening around boardroom tables on this front.
We like to say, what if the CEO wins the lottery? We prefer that expression. So yes, Poonam, succession planning, many organizations, update their plans on annual basis. And there, what's critical is the emergency successors for every key management role. But we know that if there are gaps there, it can lead to exposure. But one of the key learnings with the COVID-19 situation is the risk of having a high potential employee for more than one key as a successor for more than one key management role. So this overlap is a key risk, because with a COVID-19 crisis, there's a real risk that you invoke your succession plan for more than one role. And, I've seen when regulators review these succession plans, I've seen them, I've heard them highlight this. But with COVID-19, this risk has really come to light. And so the board, when they're considering succession plans going forward, they should really assess the strength of a succession plan by questioning the number of potential successors, the immediate successors, and also challenging the risk of the overlap in the plan, as I just explained. And the COVID-19, I think David mentioned, is a real test for leadership. I mean, we've seen that it requires not managing simply a financial crisis, but really dealing with multiple stakeholders, and whether it's the employees who are working from home or the front line, or employees who are idle, and the supply chain and investors, partners, customers, and so forth. And so this allows potential successors to emerge, to show this skill set, and maybe others to show weakness in this respect. So I think another thing that the boards should consider with respect to succession planning is to incorporate crisis management training in the leadership training of their high potential employees who are on a succession plan. You don't learn crisis management during your business as usual, everyday work. And it's quite clear that in the case of COVID-19, if your designated successor has to step in, they'll have to manage a crisis. And now is not the time to learn how to manage a crisis.
Thanks, Bridget. Dominic, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just kind of tying back to some of the things I said earlier about the stages, whether it's, an organization sitting in mobilize or stabilize. I think when you talk about succession planning with management teams, right now they're really thinking about the kind of next day scenario. As you said, Poonam, is if someone becomes ill or a family member gets ill, who's going to take the reins in the finance or production function of the organization? The tougher thing to do is to start to think about the strategize phase again, right? So if your strategy is going to change over the next 12 to 18 months, who are the key members of your team, and how are you grooming them to shift and pivot into these new areas, whether it's digital channel or just different ways to go into market? So I understand right now everyone is dealing with a crisis at hand, but it really takes some discipline to start thinking about the more longer term succession planning, as opposed to just thinking about what happens if someone in your organization falls ill.
Yep, you make a good point there, Dom, and we'll certainly talk about, and there's a number of questions that have come through both on the group chat and also to me individually about, business plans, annual business plans, and changes to strategic plans. So we'll get to those momentarily, but all good points about, kind of immediate short-term succession planning that might need to be implemented tomorrow or next week, and then the longer term in terms of some of the implications of what we're going through right now. I guess I'd like to turn to a last question on the workforce and kind of getting back to work, getting back to the new normal. What is it going to look like, and what will it mean? And I guess Saskatchewan is the first province to announce its intention to reopen the economy in a staged sort of way in early May. And it's going to be methodical and gradual and cautious and so forth. And wanted to get your thoughts, Dominic, on what this is going to look like for employees in different industries. And some of you have alluded to how this crisis will impact how employees go about doing their work. But wondering, Dominic, if you can elaborate on that. And related to a question that I just received, let me just pull it out, which is, what do you recommend for organizations, business leaders that are jumping the gun or trying to move too quickly in reopening organizations? So perhaps you want to consider that in your response as well.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and I think you can't help by from watching the news to kind of latch on to this flattening of the curve view, and I think unfortunately some organizations think that once the curve is flattened, we're going back to work and it'll be BAU, and that's the furthest thing from the truth, as we all know. I think Bridget talked earlier about the type of curve that we're going to see. Whether initially economists were talking about a V or a U, and now there's a lot more talk about a W or an L curve. So your workforce plan is really going to depend on what industry you're in and what you foresee the future will be. But for those that are looking for a return to work plan, there's 4 key areas that we're advising clients on. First is health and safety. So making sure that you are in compliance with the relevant laws and regulation, that you're establishing a sanitary and safe work environment. That's critical. That's job one. You can't put your employees in harm's way. So making sure that you're, completely online with respect to health and safety. The second thing is kind of nature of work. So looking at your organization and really, getting a good understanding of what type of sequencing you're going to put into place. So what areas of your business are really struggling with decreased productivity from a work from home environment? And how do you develop a sequencing plan that is in line with the gradual reopening of the economy to really catapult your organization when we do go back to work? The third is around financial. So thinking about the cost associated to bring your staff back on site. So opportunities to stand up new products or existing ones, and planning for fluctuations in demand. So with that being said, what will be the cost for you to bring employees back to work? And finally, I think, and Margie raised this earlier, which is, all about worker preference and psychological safety. We're seeing a lot of employees just feeling, not ready to go back to work. And we see that in China, where, although the economy's reopened to a certain extent, many are still, frankly, just afraid to go back. So I think those 4 key areas organizations really need to think about as they're contemplating business as usual.
Thanks, Dom. That's helpful. Margie or Bridget, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I guess 2 things. One, on Dominic's third point around people coming back to work, I think we will probably see that not all people come back at the same time. So the costs there are going to be multiple, in the sense of we will probably have increased costs because half of the workforce is there and half of the workforce is at home. But there's also cost to how that connectivity and social interaction will play out, and those we don't know. And then to his last point, I just want to say that we also may be losing something when we have to go back into the office. I mean, it is hard. There may be lower productivity. There may be higher productivity at home. There may be things that we get used to because this isn't a week or a couple of weeks. It's a couple of months or more. For example, just to have a little fun here, I'm wearing my suit jacket and a nice shirt, but I've got my sweats on. I don't know if you can see that, but, and I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but we are getting used to a particular way of working, and coming back, we need to recognize that there are gains and there are losses. And so we need to be thinking about what that means for the employee. And again, I think it's around, we've said it over and over, it's around flexibility. It's around trust and honesty and transparency.
Thanks, Margie.
Oh,
Bridget, and then David.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to add something. I think it'll be interesting to see how boards are going to monitor employee engagement throughout this. And, you know, you can't do everything when you're in a crisis. And what we may be seeing is a lot of the employee engagement action plans, you know, there'll be less traction on these action plans while, you know, the organization is managing the crisis. And you know, often you have employee engagement surveys on an annual basis, and you know, the timing of these surveys and also, you know, what we'll find out throughout you know, through these surveys will be kind of interesting. And that may be you know, a tool or data or information that boards are going to use to challenge management around different aspects of managing the workforce and the return to work.
Thank you. Over to you, David.
Yeah, thank you. The private equity firm I'm involved with has got 16 businesses. 2 of them had revenues go to 0. So that was pretty easy in terms of employees coming back. They're not. There's no business. But the other 14 are reasonably small enterprises. There are offices, there are plants, there are fulfillment centers, there's telephone centers. And the real risk for us here is that one employee comes back to the office and is discovered 2 days later to have had COVID-19. We have to close the office. And in essence, we're closing the business. So we have a huge, huge risk here in terms of allowing employees back who cannot certify or verify that they're free of the virus. So as you see on CNN every 15 seconds, testing, 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 testing. But in small and medium-sized businesses with 1 or 2 locations, this is survival. And we have to have some way of ascertaining the health of every single employee who walks through that door. And whether it's a test of a pinprick in the morning before you walk in, you got to stay out there for 15 minutes to see whether you're through or whether you get a certificate that you've had it and you're immunized, and assuming that that carries on. But for small and medium-sized enterprises, this is a colossal, colossal challenge for which we have no remedy at the moment. So I don't think in those other 14 businesses of ours, we're going to have people going back very soon at all, whether they're wearing their track suits or not. And what have you got on your feet, by the way, Margie?
Slippers.
Slippers. Okay.
All right. I think we've you know, shared some really important points in terms of thinking about back to work or back to the workplace. Lots of considerations that need to be worked through before it can happen. And indeed, it will be a new sort of normal. Let's turn now briefly to customers, clients. Margie, what do you think we've learned from this crisis about best practices for communicating with customers and clients, engaging with them, and treating them?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think we thought we knew it and we were already pretending to practice it, but this is where it really shows through. And I'm at the risk of repeating myself. I'm going to say it's around authenticity, so a word that we use a lot, but this is our opportunity to show it, to be honest and transparent. So we need to convey that we understand the issues and we care, but we don't know the answers. And I think that's okay. So when it comes to our customers or clients, they may be worried about some of the work that we're doing for them. They may be worried about a delivery. They may be worried about their refunds. And I think that as an organization, it's okay to say, we know that you are worried about this. And so we're alive to it, but we don't have the answer yet. So when Epic, for example, when Whistler closed down, they sent a message right away saying, our normal practice is there's no refunds on seasons passes. We will be reassessing. And I think that kind of honesty in saying, we haven't figured it all out, but we are aware of it. So park your anxiety or park as much as you can or your concern goes a long way. I think it also builds your client, customer, and employee loyalty. So when they feel that they are being heard and you're thinking about them and you're thinking hard about what they need, your brand is stronger for it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Margie. And I guess to kind of take that through now in terms of what sort of information, what sort of line of sight should boards have into changing customer kind of expectations, needs, preferences, and as a result of the crisis. And wondering, Bridget, if you might be able to speak to that briefly from your vantage point.
Sorry, I was on mute. So yes, so you know, we often say there'll be a pre and a post COVID-19 world, and that coming out of this crisis will not go back but move ahead in a different way. And consumer behavior post COVID-19 is still unknown, but it's you know, many of us believe that there'll be an impact, and as I mentioned, you know, it'll be different, and this feeds into strategic planning. So there'll no doubt be many surveys and studies that will inform the board and management. But boards should also ensure that management is gaining insight from their own customer basis. And maybe I can give an example that's close to home. So at Meridian Credit Union, we had, you know, as many other financial institutions had, we'd rolled out an online banking platform. But there's a, you know, there is a certain demographic of our membership, you know, more senior members that continue to come in branch for all of their transactions. And with the COVID-19 crisis, you know, we've had to take the time to train, you know, these and to onboard these senior members onto our online banking platform. And what we've learned is that many of them have come back, and they said they were surprised that, you know, it's actually quite user friendly, and it's, you know, something they can do, and it's something that they, you know, they were surprised how easy it could be. So we do expect to a certain extent that, you know, some of them, maybe many of them, will continue to do online banking for some of their transactions. So you know, this ties into another thing, is that this crisis allows organizations to influence consumer behavior, and we've done that with online banking. We've also done that with our wealth advisors who've reached out to clients and on video conferencing, and to talk to them about risk management for their portfolios. So you know, so this is, you know, one way to seize an opportunity to influence customer behavior. Now, there are many things we're doing differently right now. In some cases, we're not doing certain things. In other cases, we're doing them ourselves, whereas we didn't before. And the longer the crisis, the greater the possibility that that will impact our behaviors, and it will impact businesses in part or completely. And, you know, so I think boards will have to focus on that, to have a forward-looking lens on what's, you know, how consumer behavior is changing. And for one thing, boards will be focusing more on health and safety, health and wellness, but also in a broader way, not only their employees, but their customer base, more with respect to their communities. And strategic planning is going to be a context in this challenge. And what we're seeing is boards who have scheduled an annual strategic retreat are delaying it, and you know, they're rescheduling it at a later time during the year because they don't have enough data at this time to support, you know, the robust discussions they want to have. But, you know, I believe that the strategies will evolve with the COVID-19 crisis. I think with the learnings that are going to feed into it and into the board discussions, and companies will be placing more emphasis on certain aspects, but they also may very well accelerate certain aspects of their plans. And that's because organizations have become more nimble with this crisis, and they may become more aggressive with the timeline of their plan.
Really helpful, Bridget. And I think I'd like to follow up on some of the comments that you and others have made about strategy looking forward. We received a number of questions about business plans and strategy, and let me just speak to them briefly, or let me just share them with you briefly. So what impact, if any, should COVID-19 have either on the development of a strategic plan, its implementation, or reporting to the board? So that's on the strategic plan, and very much, you know, ties in with a question that I wanted to ask all of you. And I don't know, David, do you want to speak to that first, or Bridget, in terms of business strategy? Should strategies be changing right now as a result of the crisis, or should the board and senior management team continue to forge ahead based on the current strategic plan as it stands now?
I've always been a believer that strategy, while it has visions and aspirations, should be something that's continually on the board's agenda. Digital disruption was the tsunami that hit us before COVID-19, and that was transforming business after business, industry after industry. So that's not gone away. Now, in addition to that, we've got all these problems with health about which our companies know nothing. We're businesses, we're not healthcare workers or epidemiologists. So my view is that strategy should be a continuing item on every board agenda. I've always believed that. I think now it's more important than ever. If you're having an off-site strategy meeting, have it structured with the support of the management team, but I'd say bring in as many other people from as many other disciplines as you possibly could to shake the bag and rigorously re-examine what it is we think we're going to do. If you take CAE, for example, the world's largest manufacturer out of Montreal in training devices for aircraft pilots. Well, there's now 450,000 unemployed aircraft pilots. They're also, so they're not going to do a lot of training, I don't think, and they're not going to sell a lot of machines, but they started an innovation in healthcare and remote diagnostic kind of healthcare surgery. Where do you go now with that? Somebody's got to be continuously realigning which airlines are opening, which ones are closing, who are bringing on new pilots, who are furloughing the old pilots. The marketplace for the existing product line is transforming enormously. Maybe the whole thing's going online, and that Google's going to start an airline training mechanism. So the digital tsunami for them is non-trivial. But how much do they then pour into healthcare? Who are their competitors in that arena? And do they have a strategic advantage? And that's sort of a day-to-day, work it out, ruminate on it, think about it. There's no magic bullet here. But if we approach this incrementally, step by step, understanding by understanding, then I think there's an opportunity to come up with really robust, long-term, value-added kinds of business opportunities. So my main message to people worrying about strategy is put it on the agenda as a constant recurring item. Don't wait for July 12th when we're going away to play tennis and drink heavily at some resort. This should be on everybody's agenda almost every meeting, not almost every meeting.
Maybe I can add, Poonam, so I completely agree with David, and that's the case at Meridian. We have not only a strategy, an update on a strategy, but also we have a robust discussion around strategic risks at the board meeting, at every board meeting. And just to be a bit more pragmatic around how you can sort of execute upon evolving your strategy is that, the strategic initiatives report includes a lot of underlying initiatives that are ongoing to support the strategy. And, board discussions with management are going to be around how these initiatives will evolve. Some of them are completely on hold. Others are accelerated. There are new initiatives that are going to come on. And this is where there can be regular conversations around these initiatives supporting the strategy at every single board meeting. And this is in the context of strategic risks that are evolving as well.
Thank you, Bridget. That's really, really helpful. Margie, wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit more about what David and Bridget and Dom have spoken about, what sort of business opportunities can we reasonably be considering in light of this crisis? And of course, it depends on the industry and the age and stage of the particular business. But from your vantage point, what are you seeing?
Well, that saying that opportunity is risk flipped on its head, I think is really true. And there is opportunity. There's lots of different opportunities. And sometimes it's hard to be alive or to see them because we are so snowed under. But for example, this is a good test of your senior management. And I don't mean, get rid of people who are not performing well, but rather, these are opportunities to see where there might be areas for professional development. So that's one area. Mm-hmm. Certainly, it's a time where we can assess our business continuity plans. We probably all had crisis plans. We had processes that we looked at. We had a robust risk analysis program, but how did that play out? What could we do better? Where are our gaps? Where were we over-reliant? There's discussion these days on the pursuit of efficiency and the elimination of redundancy. So efficiency sounds great. We get really good at something. We have a really honed, tight delivery mechanism. But what happens, for example, when that one delivery mechanism is disrupted? Think of international supply chains. So I think that's ties into the strategy question. You know, where have we become over-reliant? Where may we have become overly efficient such that we've exposed a new risk? And then finally, I think this is an opportunity where we might be able to look at, are there any opportunities for partnership? Can we make a partner out of a competitor? Are there certain areas where we may be able to work together symbiotically? Are there opportunities for us to hone our products or our services and focus in on something that we do better? So that's another area. The only caution I'd have is that we, again, along with being snowed under, we tend to want to wait till it's over and then say, let's look back and see what we've done, where those opportunities are. But I would say that some of those opportunities are presenting themselves potentially right now, and not only as an opportunity, but as a necessity. So we need to be assessing that now while we're in the thick of it and while we're alive to all the different issues, not wait till later.
Thanks, Margie. That's really, really helpful. So let me share with you 3 questions that have come in from attendees that tie in with the conversation we just had about executive compensation and employees. And I'll share all 3 because different people might want to respond to them in different ways, directly or in some sort of a wholesale fashion. So the first is, what would be your recommendations for a unionized environment? Anything different? The second question is, obviously labor standards still apply. What can management do to modify employee remuneration, or can they? And how important is it for the board to monitor how management is changing employee remuneration? So those are in relation to the workforce at large. And then a third question relates to executive compensation. What are your thoughts about making adjustments to executive compensation, short-term, long-term incentives in light of the impact of COVID on the company's performance? So any reactions to any of those questions would be welcome.
Well, I think with respect to executive compensation, I mean, this ties into what we were talking about, incentive plans, and definitely it depends on, I think David said at first, it depends on your company, how, your industry, how your company is doing. But we saw, if we think of the last, the financial crisis we had, a lot of organizations cut their executive compensation. I was a bit surprised David mentioned boards cutting their compensation. I'm a bit curious about that trend because I've worked with a number of boards and I've rarely seen boards volunteer cutting their compensation. And maybe these are larger organizations, but that is certainly a sign of leadership. So I think this crisis is, the circumstances are such that there will be conversations around executive compensation. But you have to balance, the cost reduction measures, and if you do have the opportunity to do so, in some cases organizations don't, but to balance the cost reduction measures with the incentives you have to put in place to move forward. So that's the challenge, and that's where the conversations, to tie into what Margie mentioned, have to be open and transparent, with trust between board and management.
Thank you, Bridget, for that. Another series of questions on board communication with management, and it touches on some of the earlier points, but just to reiterate, so question here is it recommended to increase the frequency of communication between management and the board? To what extent? I don't think there's a bright line answer to that, but certainly we'll share it with the panel. And then there was another question about communication as well, just scrolling down for it. A moment. how will boards balance between reducing the burden on management and implementing the right governance during the pandemic? So any further thoughts on those points in relation to those specific questions would certainly be welcome. And certainly it ties in with your comments, David, earlier about the board chair being critical in this context. And I guess the third question that I'll throw in there is, for a large organization with many subsidiaries, what is expected from subsidiary boards when enterprise level programs also deal with the situation? So again, welcome any thoughts or reactions to those questions about board management, communication and relations, and then also in the context of enterprises where there are subsidiaries that have their own boards.
Well, I think I would reiterate the point that you've emphasized, and as the board's chair is the traffic cop in the communication linkages between the directors and the management team, and any director with any kind of concern ought to get on the phone or email his or her board chair, and just say, here's what I'm worried about, and let that person at the top, the chair, make the determination of whether this goes into the management bucket and adds to their burdens, or whether he or she deals with it individually. In terms of larger complex companies with subsidiary boards, the thing cascades in complexity. So I don't have any simple answers for that. Subsidiary boards, maybe they're empowered as external independent boards, maybe they're internal management boards. The structure is going to vary enormously, and the powers they have are going to vary hugely. I've been on 3 or 4 joint venture boards. That's another kind of creature that's out there. In fact, it's the most common form of business organization today. And they are hugely variable in terms of their membership, their fiduciary responsibilities, their ability to act responsibly. A huge question. I don't have any sort of shaft of light, one point of view on that one, Poonam.
Poonam, I can
Fair enough.
add something on
Go ahead, Dominic.
Sure. So in terms of, the burden that this is taking on management, I think that was one of the questions you raised, Poonam. I've sat in on a few organizations, kind of all hands call meetings, and what I could say is that, one way to reduce that burden is to be much more organized as it relates to your crisis management plan. So, having 2 calls a day, 1 hour for each call, taking up all the time just because it's set for an hour. I mean, not necessarily the most efficient and effective way to run a meeting. I've also seen, siloed conversations, and, the way information is tracked is through, random spreadsheets and emails. So, one way that that burden can be reduced, if you do have, a structured crisis plan, some sort of command center, so that your management team can have key information at their fingertips. And so in hopes of trying to really kind of start to reduce that burden and move forward, as opposed to, sideways with a variety of different conversations and comments that are happening on a daily basis.
Poonam, if I may, I'd just like to add something on part of the question was with respect to subsidiaries and how to manage the risks around subsidiaries during a COVID-19 crisis. So at the parent level, what I've seen, what I think is one way to deal with this is to use what's been the planned or the scheduled board education sessions, to change them into board working sessions to deal with subsidiaries that have more material risks during these, this crisis, or to go deeper with respect to how that subsidiary's finances or, risk profile is changing with respect to the COVID-19 crisis. So I am seeing boards, putting their scheduled education sessions off the table and saying, what is it we have to prioritize and focus on right now? So how are we going to use our time?
Yeah, and I'll just add on the question around the unionized environment. I don't have a lot of experience here, but one of my boards does involve an organization with a unionized environment, and we haven't actually, there are no real changes because a lot of it is controlled by the union, but the thing that I'm hearing management tell us is it's a close relationship. So there's a lot of talking between management and the head of the union in that area, and it goes back to what we talked about earlier around respect and trust and recognizing that these people are your people. So that's just on that question. And just to sort of tie in some of the other points, two of my boards are meeting weekly. We have, as we just said in the beginning, an unscripted, no prep, 1 hour meeting on the calendar. One of those boards has already tapered off. We based it on what we needed. And as David said, we have gone through our lead director or our chair, and that person checks in with us, the rest of the board, after each meeting to say, do we need another meeting next week?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's helpful. The other one, we're still at 1 a week. Our chair is still checking in with us, but it is actually, it's really useful. And so it does depend on the situation. And you need to be flexible there.
All really, really good points. And Margie, on the point about the unionized environment, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of the partnership model being, ever the more important, because again, the employees are critical here, and all of the stakeholders working together to ensure kind of future viability is critical, and compromise and trust are paramount here. Maybe David, if I could turn back to you about the appropriate role of government and the appropriate role of business. The Canadian government has committed billions of dollars in emergency funding, and just earlier today, before the panel got started, one of the attendees highlighted that the federal government just announced an agreement in principle with the provinces and territories to implement the Canadian Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program for small businesses, which will lower rent by 75% for small businesses. So your thoughts on whether we have the balance right here. Is government doing enough? Is business doing enough? Should we be recalibrating here? Is this all to be expected? Thoughts and reactions, please.
I have absolutely no idea. The proper roles of the private sector, the government sector, I think we're all thrashing around trying to find those balances. As I say, I'm encouraged by companies that are giving up executive pay at the senior levels as a demonstration of the fact that we are all in this together. I think some of the transformation, CAE is one of them, they've moved dramatically into creating new products to try and prevent shortages of certain apparel. I know Tim Gu, who makes all of the clothing for one of the famous labels for parkas that you would recognize, has moved 100% of his manufacturing into PPE and is giving that pro bono out of his own pocket to the hospitals of Ontario. So as long as I see movements like that indicate we are acting as a society and have some coherence with each other, as opposed to people saying, I've got the cure for COVID, go on the website and give me $1,000 and I'll send you my magic pills. I guess there's always going to be a distribution curve of wonderful people who are part of a larger society and act and behave in that way. And there's going to be the other end of the pyramid where they're not doing so well. But as to the balance, nobody knows. We're thrashing around. The amount of money that the Bank of Canada is printing is humongous. We already had interest rates at 0. So where do they go from here for the next one? I have no idea. And thankfully, I'm not a political economist or working in the government or a consultant in this area. So I'll go back to where I started. I have no idea, Poonam.
All right, and that's a fair answer. Any other thoughts before I ask my final question? Okay, so my final question, I think, in terms of wrapping up, unless I've missed some questions from attendees, is really just one or two major takeaways for any organization in terms of what you think can be learned from the pandemic as we're working through it now, and in terms of adapting to the new normal. And I'll ask Bridget first, because I know Bridget has to sign off in a few minutes to get to another meeting.
Yes. Thank you, Poonam. So I think, I'll repeat, I think communication is critical. I think we heard that under many of the topics we've dealt with. And, and you have to over communicate when you're dealing with this type of a crisis. And the second point I'd say is that what we say at Meridian is teamwork drives success. And you really need to collaborate more and to be innovative. And those are key values, teamwork, collaboration, innovation. And finally, one thing I mentioned at a meeting, we had a leadership meeting last week, and I mentioned that you really don't need a crisis to have a sense of urgency in an organization. And what we're seeing is that, when you do have that sense of urgency, you see friction points differently when you have to execute against a faster timeline. And that sense of urgency is something, going forward, we want to see an organization, and it can be a differentiating factor for organizations.
Thanks very much, Bridget. Who's up next? Margie, would you like to go next?
Sure. And just before I do, I just wanted to comment. Bridget had asked about director comp, and I talked about all these meetings we're having. So as an example, we agreed right in the beginning that we would not take any meeting fees for these weekly meetings. It's a small amount. It's really just a token, but that's something that we've done in our organizations. I think I have 2 points that I would like to mention now. The first is, don't underestimate your CEO and your senior team. Seek to understand what they are doing. It might not be the usual stuff that you're used to, but they are likely extremely capably managing the situation, and that trust is really important, as is the phrase, what can I do to help? So that's the first point. And the second is, as much as possible, try to think long term. This is an opportunity to care for your employees, to care for your clients and your customers, and it will create loyalty and it will build your brand.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you. Dominic?
Yeah, so kind of piggybacking on what Margie just said, I really think taking the long-term view on this is going to be critical. Burying your head in the sand and thinking that, we'll deal with strategy when this is all over. I mean, that's the worst thing you can do. And, one other small minor point is maybe thinking about doing some sort of post-incident review analysis to determine how you've reacted to this first wave. David's comment, when we go back, it's very possible that someone comes in, reinfects the floor, and you're back to the same position. So, doing some analysis now to assess how you'll deal with the next wave, I mean, it's just critical.
Thank you, Dom. And David?
Well, I think meetings like this are really vital, as nobody has the answers. There's no shaft of light from God here that can clearly indicate where we all ought to go. We're contextually dependent upon where we are as a business. But having a continuous discussion with others in the same spot, I think, is a really helpful societal and business solution trend. So any board chair, the openness of that board to what other boards are doing, collegiality with other chairs, with other directors, bring people together, find best ideas, and keep that brain open so it can absorb new postures and new points of view. That's, I think, number one. And then secondly, I think the point's been made by Margie and certainly Bridget and Dominic all together. It is a chance to rethink the business, and it's a necessity. It's not only the digital transformation, it's your workplace transformation. It's a transformation in marketplaces that are going to happen, and in supply chains. So there's nothing. I think you should start from a proposition. There's probably nothing in our business that in 2021 will remotely resemble what it was like in 2019. And if that's anywhere near true, that means that you as a board, you as a C-suite, you as an executive of any company should keep tumbling ideas around and constantly, I think, chewing away at them in order to get to some new solutions, and then move into that new world incrementally, continually re-examining your steps. So it's one step at a time, I'd say, with an opening up of the mind out of predisposed solutions that maybe used to work, but might be of absolutely no use going forward. One final little bit. I did talk to Sir Ian Davis, who's chairman of the board of Rolls-Royce, and said, what are you going to do? We're not selling many jet engines, he said. And I said, that's right. And there's an inventory of about 5,000 of them on runways all over the world. He said, well, we're trying to find out what other businesses we might get into, but it's not an easy transition from making jet engines to finding something else. But he said, we're trying everything we can to figure out where we're going to be as a company, what our skill sets are, what adjacencies might be. Everything's back to zero for Rolls-Royce.
Indeed, like so many other companies. So I just saw a couple of other questions come in, and we do have a few more minutes. So I'm going to share them with all of you, and I'll do them in 2 or 3 so that you can choose which ones you're best able to respond to. The first one is, what advice do you have for a board that is in the midst of a CEO search at this time? Boy, oh boy, that's a good question. Second one is, let me share a second question with you too, which is, what guidelines do you suggest for a not-for-profit organization that is considering a virtual AGM? It's a bit more specific, the question, in terms of organizing a virtual meeting format quote for an AGM, but any thoughts on AGMs virtually? And I know some of you have experience with that. I know there's also a GPC webinar that took place a few weeks ago that might be helpful in that context too. And then third question or comment, virtual meetings like this are effective, but conferences and courses provide an interesting opportunity to meet new people. What is the future of networking? What is the future of conferences? Are we still going to want to go to physical conferences, or is this sufficient or appropriate as we look forward? So 3 different but perhaps related questions. Over to the panelists for whichever one strikes.
Well, maybe I can start on conferences, because we've been worrying in the educational field, the Rotman School of Management, where I'm a professor, about what's going to happen. So all summer courses are virtual. Maybe the fall will have to be as well. Harvard, the business school, anybody interested in virtual education is turning out a ton of material how to make these more effective meetings. But at the end of the day, when you ask people, what did you get out of that course? It's first one is always the people I was with. Second one, there's a and then maybe it's the people I was with. And then I learned something about. So the human interaction in terms of education, gaining skill sets, understanding new perspectives, I think is at least half the field. And we're losing half of that when we're on Zoom. Otherwise, it's great, nice to be with you and all of that. And we do share good ideas. But in an educational setting where you go to learn a specific skill, the interpersonal relationships are absolutely fundamental to your learning experience. And I don't know about you, Poonam, you're in the same way. Are you looking forward to virtual classes in the fall?
Yeah, it's been quite a change. We had to do it over the course of a weekend. We were told on Friday that we would be going virtual on Monday, and then had to teach for 3 or 4 weeks virtually, and it's quite different. Of course, you get better through time, but we are indeed doing contingency planning for teaching on Zoom in the fall.
Right.
Maybe I can respond to the virtual meeting question quickly, and then unfortunately I'm going to have to leave the meeting. As I mentioned, we just had our virtual meeting yesterday evening. So the person who's asking that question is welcome to contact me. I'd be happy to share our experience. One thing I will tell you is that you cannot underestimate the amount of work internally that is required, and that we felt that because this was a virtual only meeting, and in addition it was a virtual only remote meeting, so the speakers were all in different locations, there were a lot of challenges, and the number one, what can go wrong is really technology. So you have to focus a lot on technology. So I think there was a question around also conferences going forward, in person. I'm a great fan of hybrid meetings. I've always said that, to me, hybrid meetings that allow people to attend in person, but allow broader participation by allowing some people to attend electronically or online is really the way to go. I don't think we should eliminate human interaction. I think I don't think it's appropriate. And the longer the meeting, the more beneficial, or the more value you get out of, human interaction. Yesterday after the AGM, we had a board, a meeting that generally lasts about a half an hour. And so we went the teleconference way because, you know, it was very short, and you know, that was the way to go. But for our quarterly meetings, you know, that can last, you know, several hours, I think we're going to miss the in-person meetings. So I just wanted to add that. And on that, I really enjoyed this panel, and thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you to all the participants and to GPC. Thank you, Poonam.
Thanks, Bridget. Appreciate that you have to run now. And why don't we take this opportunity just to wrap up. There are some questions that we haven't been able to answer, but we will get to them after the session is over. And Bridget, David, Dominic, Margie, thank you for the frank comments, the insightful comments, the very excellent discussion. Thank you also to all the attendees for being on and for your questions. We're here having this conversation because we care deeply about the organizations that we serve, and we have a responsibility for ensuring that they're resilient at this time and that we're able to navigate through the pandemic, and hopefully in the medium and longer term come out stronger as a result of the lessons learned and the actions taken. So Lynn, let me pass it back to you. A big thank you to you and GPC for hosting and facilitating the session.
Thank you very much, Poonam. Thank you so much to our panel for all of your insights. There was a lot of information covered, and really appreciate your firsthand insights on how we can manage some of the important questions that organizations face right now during COVID-19. I hope that most of our attendees' questions were answered. If not, if you have others you'd like to ask, we would encourage you to send those to us, either on the chat box now or to send those by email. We'll be posting the answers on our website with a video recording of this webcast for those who may have missed it. We also have other online seminars that could be of interest to you, including the one that was mentioned on virtual AGMs that we held a couple of weeks ago. I also want to point out that GPC has a couple of education sessions coming up that might be of interest to you. One is a half-day session on understanding business continuity, will be held online on May 6th, I believe at 1 to 4 p.m. and a full-day webinar on practical project management for governance professionals. So hopefully you'll attend those. And now is just a crucial time to be a member of Governance Professionals of Canada. And we encourage you all to join, as there really is no better time to hone and improve your professional skills and expertise and to connect to your peers. So GPC is there to help in that regard, and by providing insights to our events, our governance certification, our professional development and resources on the ongoing issues that you face. We're also keeping a finger on the pulse of the current developments so as to continue to bring you these useful webcast discussions and continue to have those. We're all in this together, as David fittingly said, so we hope you'll keep joining us. Thank you again to our panel, Poonam, David, Brigitte, Margie, and I'd like to thank you again very much for all the time that you put into this. And to everyone else and our participants, I wish everyone who attended a safe and happy weekend. Thank you all so very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Okay.